Hello everyone, Freemantle here. In this video I want to talk about stories and storytellers. In the 19th century, the story from the classical socialists and Marxists was that capitalism drives the people they called workers into destitution. It grinds down those who are barely hanging on, so desperately impoverishing most people that leftists who thought of themselves as realistic, in contrast to the so-called utopian socialists, the realists believed that revolution was inevitable. The workers might die in the attempt to throw down the capitalists, but they had nothing to lose. They were doomed anyway. As the century moved on and the lives of the so-called workers got better, not worse, the story was amended. Now the capitalists were buying off the workers with government relief, the same way you'd fend off an angry dog by throwing him a bone. And workers failed to understand their situation truly, thinking they were growing better off when actually their lives were getting worse, because they had false consciousness. False consciousness did not mean that they were mistaken about their situation. It meant they felt happier about their lives while they felt more miserable about their lives. And if that sounds like gobbledygook, that's what the concept of false consciousness is. But the rhetoric continued that capitalism makes things worse for just about everybody except the capitalists. When the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the 20th century, some prominent figures who were hardly best friends of capitalism, such as economist Robert Heilbronner, admitted defeat. You may be interested in two articles he wrote for New Yorker magazine. The references are at the end of the video. In the first decade of the 21st century, liberal rhetoric underwent a corresponding change. This happened over a 2-week period in 2005, in my experience, although I can't date it more precisely, and I don't know whether my experience was representative. But suddenly, liberals were saying what had long been obvious to most people, most liberals included. Capitalism is by far more productive than a thoroughly politically regulated economy. Talk of capitalism's grinding the poor abruptly dropped out of sight and hearing, and capitalism was now being blamed for being too productive and destroying the planet. A longer time perspective makes even clearer what liberals were admitting. Take the 1,000 years between an 11th century European serf and a 21st century American. Make an effort. Read Henry Hazlitt on historical poverty. Imagine the filth and fatalism of the medieval serf, and then look at your own life and prospects. The difference is not that royal houses lost their legitimacy, were replaced by representative governments, the welfare state swept in, and proceeded to redistribute the wealth of the nobles. The difference was the Industrial Revolution. Should be called the Capitalist Revolution, but that'd be to say something nice about capitalism, so of course we don't say that. Individual property rights, savings, investment, creative design, business organization, business management, and mighty implements that could do what men could not do, created human betterment on such a scale that briefly, and in the abstract, as we have to do it here, we're reduced to faded cliches if we try to express it. There is no longer any serious question of whether capitalism is the superior means of solving the general problem of poverty, of raising masses of people, and doing it faster, at lower cost, and more humanely than the alternative, and there's only one alternative: political control. It can be said, of course capitalism is the better way. Economists who aren't anti-capitalists have said it all before. Hazlitt, movingly, in The Conquest of Poverty, Friedrich Hayek, and a review of historical sources for 2 examples, and the references are at the end. To replace capitalism with a fully politically directed economy would necessarily do to the mass of people exactly what the Marxists and classical socialists condemned capitalism for doing. The liberal sometimes responds these days that he wants to supplement capitalism, not to replace it. And indeed, many Americans believe that's exactly how government regulation of the economy works. The government enters to solve a targeted, specific problem, but otherwise leaves everything basically as it is. The liberal government may make tremendous change, as in creating and sustaining the middle class by means of redistributing the wealth created by technology, as the liberal story of the middle class. But the basic dynamics of the economy remain unchanged. Still capitalism, the liberal sometimes says. That is wrong. The welfare state was not conceived to satisfy a fixed list of needs, nor does the contemporary welfare state operate as if it had such a list. Take a human life, cut it into parts, and give one part to each government agency, bureau, department, or office. The agency believes that its charge is to make the basic decisions ongoing in that part of people's lives. At the Food and Drug Administration, for instance, staffers think their legitimate business is to make the basic decisions ongoing about what people put into their bodies. Elected liberal officials believe it's their job to run the country, the state, the city, as the case may be, constantly on the lookout for problems, continually devising expert solutions and implementing them for the greater societal good. The welfare state functions as, and it results in, a systemic replacement of capitalism by government. The Soviet Union began with a fully government-regulated economy, and freedom came at the end when it fell apart. The American economy started the other way around, largely free, with controls and restrictions added as the years have moved along. Remnants of capitalism can be found in the current U.S. economy, but you have to look closely and bear in mind that while a company or an industry may be free in one respect, it may at the same time be controlled by the government in another respect, and that even where it is free, its customers and suppliers are affected by tax laws and other controls. The area of the economy that's probably freest is IT, information technology, computers. The development and proliferation of the PC put the lie to a great deal of the liberal story about capitalism we've heard all our lives, that only the rich benefit. The rich get rich and the poor get poorer. Businesses drive up prices. Businesses abuse their employees, don't want to hire the best, and won't pay their price. Big businesses are slow, hidebound. Big businesses are short-sighted. Only the government can establish standards in and for a rapidly changing industry. No one can compete against Microsoft, or GM, as liberals said 50 years ago, or take your pick. I'll also note that the internet is not run by any central authority, yet people all over the world do business in a stable, predictable environment by means of it. The technical parameters and common practices in which billions participate every day are not the products of government planners, but of those involved, engineers, business people, and the general public. The fact that liberals don't talk very much about the IT industry reinforces the idea that it's one of the freest in the economy, because the areas they do talk the most about, healthcare, financial services, and education, are the most contentious areas of the American economy, 3 areas where government regulation is extremely heavy, and probably the most tightly controlled areas in the economy. Now you might think, if capitalism is as successful as I say, why does everybody hate it? I say it's not just because liberals have been bad-mouthing capitalism for coming up on 200 years, which they have been, of course. Because that would mean people hate capitalism just because they have been told and told and told again that capitalism is hateful. Well, being told something is never a sufficient reason for believing it. We're told things every day we don't believe. People believe the liberal story of capitalism for 2 reasons. The first is that the liberal story chimes in with their own experience. The liberal says, capital and labor are enemies. I go to the boss needing a raise because my child has developed some condition that's going to require expensive treatment. The boss tells me he can't afford it. And this morning he pulled into work in a brand new BMW. Now I see, this is why the liberal says management and labor are enemies. Yes, the liberal is right about capitalism. No, he isn't. The problem is that capitalism is not perceptible as capitalism. You can listen to the boss tell you why he can't afford to give you a raise. You can see him arrive in the new car and so on. But you can't grasp all that as capitalism just through your 5 senses alone. You have to take what your 5 senses give you and string it all together to understand what capitalism is. You have to discover it, piece it together, figure it out. And it may turn out that what you experienced is something that's incidental to or a coincidence with capitalism. So people believe the liberal story about capitalism because it chimes in with their experience, and second, because they think they can simply look around and see what capitalism is. The same way you can look out the window and see the tree in the yard next door. You see its colors and the shape of it and whether the leaves are wet and so forth. People think their experiences tell them about capitalism the same way it tells them about the tree. When I was a young man, the liberal liked to say, "You want to know what capitalism is? Do some stoop labor in a farmer's field. Mine some coal. Stand on an infernally noisy auto assembly line for 8 hours. Then you'll know what capitalism is." No, you won't. And you won't know if you hang around the CEO's office for 6 months either. You have to take your experiences and think about them to figure out what, if anything, they tell you about capitalism. The vast majority of Americans, in my experience, haven't done that at all. And that's when their experiences chime in with the liberal story about capitalism. The takeaway from today's video. From the entry of contemporary liberalism into the world in the 1820s and 30s, to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, in other words, after about 170 years, many liberals will now say that capitalism does a better job of improving the material well-being of people than non-capitalist economies do. The record is unambiguous. It does. But you can't just perceive it through your 5 senses. You have to piece capitalism together, figure it out, understand it. Thank you for listening.